There is a moment we all share, a single, terrifying truth that binds every human who has ever lived. The clock stops. In that last cold silence, the greatest question of all time waits, hidden just beyond the breath you take and the light you leave behind. This fear, the fear of what comes next, or perhaps the fear of nothing at all, has been the cradle of every myth, every religion, and every dark, whispered theory across the centuries. We are drawn to the shadows of the afterlife, searching for maps to a country no one has ever truly returned from, eager to know the price of crossing the final, silent threshold. Tonight, we step softly through history's haunted halls, exploring 100 of the strangest and most chilling possibilities ever conceived about the journey of the soul. These are not comforting stories. They are the unsettling beliefs of ancient priests, philosophers, and forgotten cultures who wrestled with the terror of oblivion. From the sun-baked sands of Egypt to the dark, frozen wastes of the north, every civilization has imagined a hidden mechanism for our passing. We are here to uncover the darkest corners of human wonder, the places where faith and fear weave together into something truly eerie. The Egyptian concept of the soul's fragments. The ancient Egyptians believed your being was split into 9 distinct pieces, including the ka and the ba, and only the proper preservation of the physical body could keep these fragments connected after death. If the body was damaged, or the burial rites were forgotten, the soul's pieces would scatter, leaving the entity unable to continue its journey into the fertile lands of Aru. The ka was the life force, a spiritual double that needed offerings and food, while the ba was the soul's personality, capable of travelling between the tomb and the underworld. The process of mummification was less about honouring the dead and more a terrifying practical necessity, a binding ritual to anchor the soul's fragments to the earthly plane. Without this anchor, the pieces would be lost forever in the deep cosmic darkness, unable to face the judgment of Osiris or achieve true immortality. The ritual ensured the Ak, the final, unified form of the spirit, could emerge, but only if the delicate balance of the ka and ba was maintained for thousands of years. The true horror lay in the concept of second death, where even after successfully reaching the underworld, a forgotten name or destroyed body could lead to the complete annihilation of the spirit. The soul would cease to be in any form, a prospect far more chilling than any painful torment. This fear is why the Egyptians inscribed their names everywhere, creating a permanent record against the creeping final oblivion that lurked in the silent gaps of eternity. The Greek shade and the waters of Lethe, the ancient Greeks believed the soul's fate was a cold one, to become an eidolon, a hollow, weightless shade of their former self endlessly, drifting in the dark, sunless underworld of Hades. Heroes and common people alike shared this fate, losing their vital memory and passion, reduced to a whispery echo. This underworld was not necessarily a place of punishment, but a place of profound, chilling lessening, a dim reflection of the vibrant world of the living they left behind, eternally cut off from light. The true source of horror in the Greek afterlife was the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, which many souls were forced to drink from before finding their final resting place. This act completely erased all memory of their mortal life, their loves, and their accomplishments, a fate arguably worse than any physical torment. They became utterly anonymous ghosts, unable to recall the very essence of who they were, doomed to wander the bleak plains of asphodel as historical blanks. This belief meant that the highest honour a person could receive was a proper burial and the continued recitation of their name by the living. If your name was forgotten, your identity was lost both in the world of the living and the world of the dead, making your life utterly meaningless. The fear of being a nameless, forgotten shade, condemned to an empty half-existence where your memories are only dust, was a profound, creeping terror. The Norse Helheim and the Ship of Nails, for the Norse, the dreary afterlife of Helheim, ruled by the cold goddess Hel, was the destination for most who died of sickness or old age, rather than inglorious battle. It was a bleak, frigid and damp realm, where the dead suffered neither physical pain nor great joy, but instead endured perpetual agonizing boredom and a lack of light. The horror lay in the endless, slow decay of the spirit, a gradual slide into utter emotional neutrality and spiritual stagnation under the frost. One of the most unsettling structures in Norse cosmology was Naglfar, the ship of the dead, said to be made entirely from the unclipped fingernails and toenails of the deceased. When the world-ending Battle of Ragnarok finally arrived, this grotesque vessel would sail, carrying the enemies of the gods into the final war. This belief created a dark obligation for the living, to cut their nails before burial, ensuring they did not contribute material to the great ship of destruction. The concept is chillingly practical, tying a mundane personal neglect, forgetting to clip one's nails, to a cosmic horror and the doom of the entire world. It suggests that even in death, the smallest, most ignored parts of the body hold a dark, destructive power that could contribute to the end of all things. The fate of those on the ship was not merely death, but to be a weapon wielded against the world they once knew. The Babylonian realm of no return. The Babylonians conceived of the afterlife as the land of no return, a vast dusty underworld known as Irkala, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. It was described as a silent, lightless dwelling where the dead were forced to eat nothing but dry dust and wear clothes made only of feathers, stripped of all earthly possessions, rank, or comfort. The realm was sealed by 7 formidable gates, ensuring that any soul that entered could never, under any circumstance, escape back to the living world. The most terrifying part of this theory was the complete equality of misery. Regardless of a person's good deeds or wickedness in life, everyone shared the same grim fate in Irkala. Kings and slaves, heroes and criminals all became identical, powerless shades doomed to the same diet of dust. This theory offered no hope of paradise, no chance of reward, only the certainty of a slow, eternal decay in a silent subterranean prison beneath the earth. To avoid the worst fate, being permanently forgotten and turning into a wandering demon, the dead relied entirely on the living to provide them with water through a funerary pipe. Without this steady stream of refreshment, the spirit would become thirsty and restless, returning to the world of the living as a malevolent ghost to torment their negligent family, seeking the water they were denied. The Chinese ghost bureaucracy. Traditional Chinese belief presented the afterlife not as a spiritual realm, but as a vast, chilling bureaucracy known as Diyu, or the underworld. It functioned like a supernatural government, complete with 10 courts, judges, and demon clerks who processed the dead and assigned them to various levels of punishment or rebirth. The soul was a filing case, passing through agonizing judicial review, where every single misdeed was catalogued and examined in terrifying detail. The judges in Diyu were known to use horrific elaborate tortures, not as eternal punishment, but as a temporary corrective measure before reincarnation. Each court dealt with a specific sin, one for lying, where the tongue was cut out, another for theft, where the heart was sliced open. This suggests a mechanical, emotionless system of cosmic justice, where torment is simply a necessary step in the relentless, administrative flow toward a new life. The true chilling element is the paper trail. The living must burn paper money and other offerings so that the deceased have enough funds to bribe the various underworld officials and avoid the worst punishments. It implies that the celestial justice system can be corrupted, and that the only true difference between a painful and a peaceful afterlife is the material wealth provided by your family after you die. The Zoroastrian Bridge of Judgment. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths, presents a terrifying threshold known as the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of separation that every soul must cross 3 days after death. The bridge's width changes drastically based on the person's deeds during life. For the righteous, it becomes a comfortable span, wide enough for safe passage to paradise. For the wicked, however, it narrows to the width of a razor's edge, making the crossing a near impossible agonizing struggle over the abyss. This perilous passage is guarded by 2 figures, a beautiful maiden representing the soul's good deeds, or an ugly, cackling crone representing its wickedness, who meets the spirit at the bridgehead. If the soul falls, it plunges into the terrifying pit of eternal darkness and chilling cold known as the House of the Lie. The dread lies in the immediate 3-day waiting period, where the soul already perceives its coming fate based on its past actions. The terrifying immediacy of the judgment and the physical reality of the razor-thin bridge make this theory intensely unsettling. The soul is not judged by a distant god, but by the tangible manifestation of its own moral past, which literally shapes the terrain it must traverse. This bridge crossing is the ultimate solitary test, determining whether the afterlife is a fragrant garden or a plummet into endless, freezing oblivion. The Maya's Xibalba and the blood sacrifice. The ancient Maya believed the dead descended into Xibalba, the place of fright, a deep, 9-level underworld ruled by the death gods. This was not a place of rest, but a house of constant peril and tests. The soul's journey was fraught with trickery, including deceiving paths, rivers of blood and pus, and 6 specific death houses, like the House of Knives or the House of Bats, that were designed to kill the spirit a second time. To ensure safe passage and avoid the death god's sadistic games, the dead often needed to be equipped with specific tools or charms. High-ranking members of Maya society were sometimes buried with complex instructions or symbolic offerings, meant to bribe or outwit the cunning lords of Xibalba. Failure meant the soul was doomed to wander the terrifying, confusing maze of the underworld eternally, unable to find rest or rebirth. Furthermore, the Maya often practiced blood sacrifice while the person was still alive or immediately after death, believing that the shedding of vital blood was the necessary offering to appease the lords of Xibalba. This dark ritual was seen as a payment in advance, a desperate measure to clear the soul's path and ensure it survived the gauntlet of the underworld's houses of torture and fear. The Inuit land of the sky and the hungry dead. For the Inuit people, the fate of the soul depended entirely on how one died. Those who died violently or tragically went to Quidlivun, the peaceful land of the sky, but those who died of natural causes faced the harsh and often terrifying underworld. The belief focused on the danger of unhappy spirits known as tupilaks, which were vengeful ghosts created by sorcery or dark, lingering energy. A tupilak was a shadowy entity, often invisible, that relentlessly hunted its intended victim, both the living and other souls. The greatest fear was not the afterlife itself, but the soul's vulnerability to these angry, cold spirits immediately upon leaving the body. To counteract this, the living had complex rituals designed to confuse or distract these hungry, wandering entities from claiming the recently departed spirit. The chilling aspect is the idea that the soul must carry its own darkness and guilt into the afterlife, which attracts these malevolent forces. The departed spirit could be chased across the desolate spiritual tundra by these invisible predators, forever denied peace. This concept emphasizes the deep, cold loneliness of the soul, isolated and hunted in the vast spiritual wilderness, the Roman soul's need for a coin. The ancient Romans inherited the Greek tradition of the underworld journey, but emphasized the necessity of a single coin, the obolus, placed either on the tongue or over the eyes of the deceased. This coin was the fare demanded by the ferryman Charon to transport the soul across the river Styx and Acheron into Hades. Without this payment, the soul was considered a pauper and would be condemned to wander the near bank of the river for 100 years. This fate of being a bankrupt ghost was a profound humiliation and a terrifying sentence. These wretched, uncrossed souls, known as the insepulti, were trapped between worlds, too far from life to be resurrected and too poor for death to claim them fully. They were left to mourn their own neglect, unable to find rest, silently watching the procession of others crossing into the final darkness. The horror is rooted in the social structure. The afterlife became an extension of earthly poverty, a place where a single, tiny act of negligence by the living could sentence the spirit to a century of spiritual homelessness and existential dread. It makes the afterlife transactional and cruel, where cosmic passage depends not on virtue, but on having the proper currency in death. The Mesopotamian dust and feathers. Mesopotamian cultures, preceding the Babylonians, had an even bleaker view of the underworld, where the spirits were covered in dust and longed only for water. The deceased were doomed to a joyless existence where they drank muddy water and ate dust, forever wishing for the sensory pleasures of the living world. This was the dark, silent fate of all, irrespective of social standing or moral conduct during their brief time on Earth. The only way to ease the agony of the departed was through the living performing the Kispu ritual, which involved pouring cool water and offering food to the ancestors. If the living family neglected this ritual, the deceased spirit would become enraged, transforming into a malignant, hungry ghost known as an Utuku or Ekimu, which would return to prey upon the family and curse their lives. This theory introduces the terrifying concept of dependence on the living for peace in the afterlife. The dead become emotional hostages to the memory and diligence of their descendants, threatening them from beyond the veil. The afterlife is not a release, but a conditional imprisonment, constantly held in check by the rituals of the living. The Viking soul's separation from the body. While many Vikings hoped for Valhalla, the joyous hall for warriors, the reality was that most souls went to the realm of the mound dwellers, trapped within their own burial mounds. The deceased Haugboy, or mound dweller, was a spirit bound to its treasure hoard and its earthly resting place, perpetually guarding its wealth beneath the earth. These spirits were often malevolent, hostile to anyone who dared to disturb their grave or steal their possessions. This belief meant that for many, the afterlife was a literal, dark, and earth-bound existence within a cramped, cold tomb. The spirit was not free. It was physically anchored to a single location, condemned to endless, solitary defense of material goods it could no longer use. The mound dweller's rage was a physical threat, able to attack and kill those who approached the grave. The ultimate horror lies in the fact that the soul's rest was dependent on the security of its grave. If the grave was plundered or damaged, the Haugboy would be released, not to freedom, but to a terrifying, vengeful, undead existence, causing blight and death to the living nearby. The afterlife was a suffocating prison that could turn its inhabitant into a creature of pure malice. The Celtic otherworld and the mist. The Celts believed in an otherworld known as Tir na Nog, Land of Youth, or Mag Mell, Plain of Joy, a hidden realm that existed co-equally with the living world, often veiled by a thick enchanted mist or located just beneath the sea. However, accessing this realm was incredibly difficult, requiring either the patronage of a powerful god, a chance encounter, or a terrifying, deliberate crossing of a misty, blurred boundary. The chilling aspect of this paradise was its relationship with time. If a living person managed to cross into the other world and then returned, only a few hours might have passed for them, but decades, or even centuries, would have flown by in the world of the living. This meant that any brief, joyful return would condemn the person to witness the complete death of their world and everyone they knew. This theory offers a terrifying paradox. The soul finds ultimate peace and eternal youth, but it must give up its connection to the temporal world absolutely. The paradise is so separate from reality that the mere attempt to revisit the living world results in devastating loneliness and the absolute destruction of their past life, making the final choice to cross over an ultimate mournful severance. The Shinto path and the polluted world. In Shinto belief, the world of the dead is Yomi no Kuni, a dark, underground land of the perpetually decaying. Once a soul enters Yomi, it becomes eternally unclean or polluted Kagara, making any return to the vibrant, clean world of the living fundamentally dangerous and impossible. The concept is less about divine judgment and more about spiritual contamination, a state of being that is inherently repulsive to the living world. The terrifying story of the goddess Izanami, who became trapped in Yomi, illustrates the horror. Her husband, Izanagi, attempted to rescue her, but was horrified to find her decomposing and covered in maggots. He fled, sealing the entrance with a boulder. This act symbolizes the finality and the absolute spiritual decay of the dead, creating an insurmountable physical barrier between the living and the deceased. Therefore, the living must practice meticulous ritual purity to ensure they do not become spiritually contaminated by proximity to death. The soul in Yomi is not necessarily tormented, but is permanently lost and unclean, a radioactive spiritual element that must be sealed away. The afterlife is a place of perpetual, silent spiritual rotting, a darkness that must never be allowed to touch the world of light. The Aztec journey and the obsidian dogs. The Aztecs believed the common soul embarked on a 4-year, agonizing journey to Mictlan, the lowest of 9 dark subterranean levels. This journey was filled with geographical and spiritual obstacles. Souls had to navigate treacherous mountains that crashed together, withstand freezing winds, and pass through a vast desert under the watchful eyes of invisible predators. The entire process was a harsh, slow test of endurance. The soul's guide and companion on this 4-year trek was the Soloitzkintli, a specific breed of hairless dog, which had to be sacrificed and buried with its master to help the soul cross the final, treacherous river of the underworld. If the deceased was cruel to dogs in life, no dog would help them, leaving the soul stranded and unable to complete the journey to the final resting place. The terrifying dependency on the dog highlights the soul's vulnerability. The true, creeping fear is that the soul is utterly alone on this long, dark road, and the only potential companion is a dog whose loyalty depends on the deceased's past morality. Failure to reach Mictlan meant the soul simply dissolved into the darkness of the lower levels, never achieving true rest. The ancient Hebrew Sheol, a silent pit. Before the later development of heaven and hell, the ancient Hebrews believed that all the dead, regardless of virtue, went to Sheol, a shadowy, silent pit beneath the earth. Sheol was not a place of fire or torment, but of profound nothingness, a land where the dead existed as weak, silent shades, incapable of worship, passion, or even memory of the living world. The true dread of Sheol was its democratic emptiness. It was the ultimate equalizer, stripping everyone of their earthly identity and significance. There was no joy for the righteous and no specific punishment for the wicked, simply a collective, silent non-existence that slowly erased the soul's vibrant memory. The dead were cut off from God and life itself, reduced to utterly impotent forms. This concept makes the afterlife intensely chilling because it robs death of any meaning or promise. The soul is not tormented, but merely diminished to an absolute minimum of being, a breath too weak to register in the cosmic order. The horror is the loss of purpose and the cold, eternal silence, a final destination without hope or light. The Buddhist hungry ghosts. In Buddhist cosmology, one of the worst rebirths is to become a preta, or a hungry ghost, trapped in a specific realm where they are constantly tormented by insatiable desires. These ghosts are defined by their tragic physical forms. They have bloated bellies and impossibly narrow throats, meaning they can never ingest enough food or water to satisfy their intense, burning hunger and thirst. The condition of the hungry ghost is not an arbitrary punishment, but a direct consequence of intense greed, jealousy, and stinginess during their human life. the soul is literally reborn into a body that makes gratification impossible, forever seeking what it can never truly hold or consume. This makes the afterlife a direct, physical manifestation of one's worst moral failures. The horror is the perpetual psychological anguish. The ghost sees food and water everywhere, but the moment it attempts to consume it, the substance turns to ash, fire, or sludge in its mouth. It is an eternal cycle of desperate yearning and painful physical frustration, a tragic symbolic existence built around unending, agonizing need. The Sumero-Akkadian Seven Gates. The ancient Sumerians and Akkadians believed the descent into the underworld of Kur was through a series of 7 heavily guarded gates. As the soul passed through each gate, it was forced to surrender one item of clothing or one ornament, signifying the complete, terrifying stripping away of their earthly identity, rank, and possessions. By the time the soul reached the final court of Ereshkigal, it was completely naked, destitute, and defenseless, reduced to its most basic, vulnerable spiritual form. This systematic spiritual undressing was a psychological torture, meant to erase all traces of the human life the soul had once enjoyed. The loss of dignity preceded the final judgment and the consumption of dust. This process is chilling because it highlights the utter powerlessness of the dead. The afterlife is a customs house of the soul, where the traveller is systematically robbed of everything that made them who they were, leaving them entirely exposed and dependent on the mercy of the terrifying, unseen judges of the deep. The true price of passage is the total erasure of self. The Melanesian coral net. In some traditional Melanesian island cultures, the path to the afterlife included a terrifying gauntlet after death, where the soul had to pass through a giant spiritual coral net. This net, suspended in the depths of the ocean or the air, was guarded by a malevolent spirit whose specific task was to snare and capture the spirits of the deceased. The only way a soul could successfully pass through the net was if it was small and light, meaning the soul was free of heavy earthly attachments, grudges, and wickedness. A soul weighted down by evil deeds or intense emotional baggage would be easily snagged by the coarse coral threads, trapped forever, unable to continue to the peaceful ancestral islands. This theory makes the spiritual journey a literal physical challenge, where morality translates into weight. The fear is the spiritual weight of guilt, which drags the soul down and prevents it from passing through the fine mesh of judgment. The afterlife is a cruel, passive trap, designed to capture the heavy, wicked, and unforgiven. The Indigenous American Spirit Road. Many Indigenous American cultures believe the soul embarks on a long solitary journey along the Spirit Road or Milky Way, a path often guarded by dangerous entities or obstacles. For some tribes, the road led to a beautiful, vast hunting ground, but it was fraught with the danger of spiritual contamination and the constant threat of wandering, malevolent ghosts who sought to pull the soul off the path. The difficulty lies in the rule of the journey. The soul must not look back at the world it left behind. If the deceased breaks this rule, their spirit is instantly turned into stone or permanently stranded, unable to complete the journey to the land of the ancestors. The journey required absolute focus and a final, complete, emotional severance from the world of the living. This creates a terrifying psychological test at the moment of death, where the soul's last emotional thought can doom it to eternal stagnation. The afterlife offers a reward but demands the soul prove its absolute emotional discipline by forsaking all memory of its previous life. The road to peace is paved with the silent denial of all past love and life. The Japanese concept of the death god, Ema-o. In Japanese folk Buddhism, the dead are judged by Ema-o, Yama, the terrifying bull-headed king of hell who sits in his infernal court weighing the soul's deeds. Ema-o uses a supernatural mirror, the mirror of karma that reflects every single action the deceased ever performed in life, revealing the hidden truths and intentions behind every deed. There are no secrets in the presence of this silent, unforgiving mirror. The judgment is not just based on the actions themselves, but on the true spiritual weight of the intentions. A seemingly good deed done for selfish reasons might weigh more heavily than a small forgivable sin. The horror is in the unavoidable confrontation with one's total self, stripped bare of all excuses and self-deception before the towering silent judge. After the judgment, the soul is often forced to pass over the Sanzu River, which has 3 crossings depending on the weight of the soul's sins. The wicked are forced to cross a deep, fast-flowing section full of demons and serpents, symbolizing the intense, dangerous struggle they must endure before their ultimate fate is determined: the African Yoruba ancestral forest. The Yoruba people of West Africa believe that the ultimate goal is for the soul to become an ancestor, a gungun, and join the ancestral realm, a spiritual forest, Igbo Irunmel, where they can observe and influence the world of the living. However, not everyone makes it. Those who lived a bad life, died of a shameful disease, or died too young are rejected, becoming wandering low-level ghosts known as Iwin. The true danger lies in the Iwin, who are jealous, confused, and malevolent, constantly attempting to sabotage the living or trick new souls into joining their wretched, lonely state. The living must meticulously perform rituals to elevate the soul's status, essentially petitioning the powerful established ancestors to accept the newly dead into the spiritual fold. The terror is that the afterlife is not guaranteed. It is a social construct that requires the continued validation and maintenance by the living family. A soul that is forgotten, or whose rituals are neglected, is doomed to eternal petty malice as a jealous, powerless ghost. Peace depends entirely on the respect and memory of the descendants left behind, the Siberian shamanic soul loss. Siberian shamanism often speaks of the soul splitting into multiple parts, often 3 or more upon death, with each fragment having a different destiny. The most important fragment, the life soul, often travels to the underworld to join the ancestors, but the other fragments can be lost, stolen, or damaged, leading to terrifying consequences for the deceased. The most chilling belief is soul loss while a person is alive, where a soul fragment might be stolen by an evil spirit or simply wander off. If this fragment is not recovered by the shaman before death, the complete entity cannot fully form in the afterlife, leading to a permanent tragic incompleteness. The deceased remains a fragmented, confused, and weak entity, forever seeking its missing piece. The shaman's primary duty is to retrieve these lost fragments, often venturing into terrifying spiritual realms to bargain for their return. The afterlife is therefore a desperate, ongoing struggle for spiritual wholeness, where a portion of the person is always held hostage by the darkness, leaving the deceased incapable of true rest or ancestral unity. The Celtic theory of the cursed. Well. A lesser-known Celtic theory involved a cursed well or dark pool in the otherworld, where souls were forced to drink. This well did not grant forgetfulness like the Greek lethe, but instead forced the soul to eternally re-experience the moments of its deepest guilt and shame. The spiritual liquid acted as a mirror, reflecting every moral failure in excruciating perpetual detail. The soul was not physically tortured, but condemned to an endless loop of psychological self-recrimination, reliving the worst decisions and the pain inflicted on others. This internal suffering was a punishment, far more insidious than fire or demons, as the soul became its own tormentor, unable to escape the memory of its own wickedness. The subtle horror is that the afterlife is a simple, dark reflection. By drinking from the well, the soul accepts its own moral truth and is forced to wear that truth as its only eternal garment. The ultimate punishment is not externally inflicted, but is the eternal, unforgiving clarity of its own moral ledger. The Germanic Woden's wild hunt. In Germanic folklore, the souls of the unbaptized, the wicked, and those who died violently were sometimes swept up into Woden's wild hunt, a terrifying, nocturnal, airborne procession of ghosts and monstrous dogs that tore through the night sky. The hunt was a massive, chaotic spiritual army, led by the god Woden, or a similar spectral figure, constantly searching for new souls to drag into their endless, frantic chase. The spirits caught in the wild hunt were never allowed to rest. They were condemned to perpetual panicked motion, constantly screaming as they were carried through the cold air. To see the wild hunt was an omen of death or calamity, and any living person caught outside during the procession risked being swept up and forced to join the spiritual chase. This terrifying theory makes the afterlife not a destination, but a state of eternal turmoil and flight. The soul is denied peace, instead becoming a screaming, nameless particle in a swirling storm of spiritual anguish, forever running from a nameless ultimate pursuer. It is the spiritual equivalent of endless, traumatic, panicked flight. The Polynesian Shark God. In some Polynesian traditions, the journey to the afterlife involved crossing a vast, dangerous spiritual ocean where the soul was hunted by a terrifying, primordial shark god. This god's primary role was to consume the souls of the wicked or those who failed to observe the proper burial rituals. The sea was an eternal dark maw waiting to swallow the failed or negligent spirit. The soul's only hope was the proper recitation of prayers and the provision of specific charms by the living, which would supposedly grant the spirit safe passage or provide temporary camouflage. If the rituals were forgotten, the soul was considered vulnerable and would be instantly devoured by the shark god, leading to its absolute destruction and non-existence. The terror is the sheer, overwhelming power of the final gatekeeper. The soul must brave a massive, ancient entity of pure, consuming malice that patiently patrols the spiritual ocean. Failure means not just punishment, but a sudden, terrifying annihilation, being reduced to nothing inside the belly of a hungry primal god. The Christian purgatorial fire. Medieval Christian theology popularized the chilling concept of purgatory, a third, temporary state where the souls of the saved must undergo a painful, cleansing fire before they are pure enough to enter heaven. Unlike hell, this fire was understood to be redemptive, but the pain was believed to be just as real and intense as the flames of damnation. The soul suffered for its venial, minor sins. The terror of purgatory was the uncertainty of how long the suffering would last. It could be weeks, centuries, or even millennia, depending on the soul's remaining debt. The living were constantly urged to pay for masses and prayers, known as suffrages, to reduce the soul's sentence, creating a desperate transactional relationship between the living and the suffering dead. This made the afterlife a continuing economic and spiritual burden on the family left behind. The soul, though destined for salvation, was condemned to a period of agonizing, indefinite waiting, dependent entirely on the cash flow and devotion of their earthly kin to shorten their time in the agonizing, refining flames. The Islamic bridge of Al-Sirat Islamic tradition describes Al-Sirat, a bridge that must be crossed by all souls on the day of judgment before entering paradise. Like the Zoroastrian bridge, it is described as being thinner than a hair and sharper than a sword, suspended over the raging fire of hell, Jahannam. The speed and ease with which the soul crosses depend entirely on the purity of their faith and deeds. The faithful will cross with incredible speed, like lightning, but the wicked will tremble, slip, and ultimately fall from the razor-thin path into the depths of hell. The greatest terror is the sheer physical impossibility of the crossing, an ultimate trial of balance where even the slightest misstep, driven by doubt or sin, results in eternal catastrophic failure. This theory makes the final judgment intensely visceral and physical. The ultimate fate of the soul hinges on a terrifying moment of precarious balance, where the spiritual weight of a single bad deed could cause the soul to lose its footing and plummet into the abyss of eternal burning. It is a moment of absolute, terrifying suspense. The Catholic concept of limbo. The Catholic Church historically included the concept of limbo, a third place distinct from heaven, hell, and purgatory. It was typically divided into two sections: the limbo of the fathers, where righteous people waited before Christ's resurrection, and the limbo of infants, where unbaptized babies who committed no sin went. The horror of the limbo of infants was that the souls were not tormented. They experienced perfect natural happiness and were safe from punishment, but they were eternally denied the beatific vision, the sight of God. They were forever kept at a distance from the ultimate desired end of existence, a life of perpetual blissful near miss. This introduced a chilling spiritual class system. Even the innocent could be excluded from ultimate bliss based on a technicality, lack of baptism, leading to an eternal, profound spiritual loneliness. Their eternity was defined by a perfect silent exclusion from the final presence of the divine light, the medieval devil's claim. In medieval popular belief, the moment of death was not peaceful, but a frantic physical battle for the soul. Demons and angels would gather at the bedside, and if the dying person showed even a flicker of doubt or made one final small sin, a mortal sin on the deathbed, a devil could claim the soul immediately, overriding any past good deeds. This belief gave rise to the art of the ars moriendi, the art of dying, which provided instructions and prayers to combat the demons who tempted the dying person with despair, pride, or avarice in their final moments. The final breath was a desperate psychological wrestling match against the forces of darkness vying for the soul. The horror is that the entire moral weight of a lifetime could be undone by a single, final, terrified thought or doubt. The devil was always waiting, holding a legalistic claim, ready to swoop in and steal the soul in its moment of maximum weakness and vulnerability, making death a dramatic, terrifying, final spiritual confrontation. The Jewish concept of resurrection and ossuaries. While there are many beliefs in Judaism, the traditional idea of resurrection held that the body would be physically reunited with the soul at the end of days. This led to the chilling practice of secondary burial, where the bones of the deceased were collected a year after the initial burial, placed into small limestone boxes called ossuaries, and stored in family tombs. The need to keep the bones intact was paramount, as it was believed that the entire body, or at least the bones, would be necessary for the soul to properly reform during the resurrection. This means the afterlife was perpetually on hold, the soul waiting in an incomplete state for the final, chaotic moment of world-ending reunion. The anxiety stemmed from the fear of a scattered body. If the bones were lost, burned, or scattered, the soul might be unable to fully reconstitute itself, leading to eternal incompleteness or an inability to participate in the promised new world. The afterlife's promise depended on the careful, often unsettling maintenance of the physical remains. The Russian Orthodox toll houses. In Russian Orthodox Christianity, the soul's passage to judgment is marked by the ascent through 20 terrifying spiritual customs points called aerial toll houses. As the soul rises through the air, it is stopped by demons who act as customs officers, accusing the soul of specific named sins. One toll house for lying, another for gluttony, another for envy, and so on. The demons possess meticulous records of every sin the person committed, and the soul must either confess the sin and accept the temporary demonic torment, or an accompanying angel must pay the spiritual toll by presenting a good deed that outweighs the sin. The soul is essentially audited on its way to heaven, with no way to hide any moral transgression. The sheer bureaucratic horror of this belief is intensely chilling. The afterlife is not a simple ascent, but a meticulous, legalistic, terrifying gauntlet where the soul's weaknesses are methodically exposed and used against it by relentless, demonic accountants. The ascent is slow, painful, and entirely dependent on the balance sheet of a lifetime, the voodoo concept of the undead. In Haitian Vodou, the soul, gros bon ange, leaves the body, but a piece of the spirit, T-Bonange, remains vulnerable for 9 days. The most terrifying theory is that a malicious sorcerer, a Bokor, can capture this vulnerable spiritual fragment and trap it inside a physical body, removing its will and condemning it to an undead, enslaved existence, the infamous zombie. The zombie is not the original person, but the body animated by the sorcerer's will, a terrifying physical manifestation of a soul that has been robbed of its consciousness and personal freedom. The spirit is trapped in a dark, silent void inside its own body, forced to watch helplessly as it performs the sorcerer's will, unable to communicate or act. This makes the afterlife a direct threat to personal sovereignty. The fear is not just of death, but of being condemned to a physical state of perpetual conscious spiritual imprisonment. The soul is never allowed to fully leave, instead becoming a silent, enslaved witness to its own eternal humiliation and servitude. The Gnosticism of the Archons. Gnosticism, an early mystical belief, proposed that the material world was created by an evil or ignorant lesser deity, and that the universe is governed by malevolent demonic jailers called Archons. Upon death, the soul attempts to ascend to the true divine pleroma, heaven, but the Archons patrol the spheres between the earth and the pleroma, attempting to capture, interrogate, and re-imprison the soul in a new body. The Archons feed on the soul's ignorance and try to trick the spirit into revealing the passwords or true knowledge it needs to pass safely. If the soul is ignorant, it is captured, its memory is wiped, and it is recycled into a new, painful body on earth, forever trapped in the cycle of suffering known as samsara. The terror is that the universe itself is a conscious trap. The Archons are bureaucratic, cosmic demons who view the human soul as a runaway asset that must be recovered and re-enslaved. The afterlife is a secret, terrifying escape route through enemy territory, requiring secret knowledge only gained in life. The ancient Greek Tartarus and eternal punishments. While Hades was the general realm of the dead, the most wicked souls were condemned to Tartarus, a deep, inescapable abyss reserved for eternal, highly specific punishments. These punishments were not arbitrary, but perfectly tailored to the sin committed in life, creating an eternal irony of torment. The famous examples, like Sisyphus endlessly rolling a boulder uphill only to have it roll down, or Tantalus standing in water up to his neck, forever reaching for fruit he can't grasp, illustrate this horror. The soul is forced to repeat a single, agonizing, meaningless task for all eternity, the physical action becoming a metaphor for their moral failure. The terror of Tartarus is the absence of release or change. The afterlife becomes a perfect, permanent loop of frustration, where the soul knows exactly how its task will fail, yet is compelled to repeat it forever. It is a mathematical, psychological torture that never ends. The Jewish Gehenna of fire. In Jewish thought, Gehenna, the word which gave rise to the concept of hell, was a temporary place of fiery cleansing for the souls of the wicked, or those who needed final purification. The traditional belief was that most souls only remained in Gehenna for a maximum of 12 months, where they were exposed to a painful spiritual fire that burned away their sins. However, the souls of the utterly wicked, the heretics, the betrayers, and those who sinned deliberately against the community were believed to be subjected to the fire for the full 12 months, and at the end of that time, their souls would be utterly destroyed and cease to exist. They were not tormented forever, but erased from the fabric of creation. The horrifying implication is the finality of oblivion. The most grievous punishment is not eternal pain, but eternal non-existence, a complete erasure of identity and memory. The soul is consumed by the righteous fire, and when the flames die out, there is nothing left. The Universalist doctrine of absolute salvation. A terrifying philosophical inversion of the afterlife is the Universalist Christian doctrine that all souls will eventually be saved and reconciled with God, even those in hell, after a long finite period of suffering. While seemingly comforting, this doctrine is chilling because it suggests that the pain and torment of hell are necessary and guaranteed for everyone who dies in sin. The true horror is the certainty of temporary suffering. Since all sin must be accounted for and cleansed, the soul is guaranteed a period of agonizing correctional torment before it is ultimately released into paradise. Death is not a release from suffering, but a doorway to a guaranteed temporary sentence of extreme pain. This removes the comfort of instantaneous grace and replaces it with the cold, legalistic certainty of an agonizing spiritual debt that must be paid in full. The afterlife is a cosmic hospital of pain, where every soul must undergo a guaranteed and necessary spiritual surgery of purification. The ghost's need for vengeance. Across almost every culture, the spirit of a person who died a sudden, unjust or violent death is not allowed to rest, becoming a vengeful ghost, onryo in Japan, poltergeist in Germany, etc. These spirits are condemned to wander the world of the living, obsessed with exacting revenge on the person, family or institution that wronged them. The true horror is that the afterlife for these souls is not a realm of peace, but an endless, consuming obsession with the past. The spirit's entire existence is reduced to a single burning purpose: to inflict pain. They are spiritually diseased by their own trauma and unable to transition to a higher state of being. The soul's continued existence is powered by its own agonizing trauma and rage, becoming a self-perpetuating engine of malice. The only release for the ghost is the fulfillment of its revenge, which often requires the destruction of the person or place that caused its death, trapping the living in the spiritual conflict of the dead. The Norse Nastrond, shore of corpses. The Norse had a place of punishment separate from Helheim called Nastrond, or the Corpse Shore, a vast horrible hall reserved specifically for the oathbreakers, murderers and adulterers. The hall was made entirely of woven serpent backs, and venom dripped from the ceiling, constantly pooling into rivers that the condemned were forced to wade through. The spiritual punishment was specifically focused on betrayal and malice. The venom symbolized the spiritual poison that the condemned introduced into the world through their treachery, and they were forced to absorb and wallow in this corrosive spiritual acid for eternity. The hall itself was a living, breathing testament to their own wickedness. The subtle horror is the lack of escape. The only way out is through one of the hall's doors, which open only toward the north, the coldest and darkest direction, symbolizing the final cold hopelessness of their spiritual fate. The afterlife is a vile, venom-filled mirror of their own moral corruption. The Buddhist Avidsi hell of no respite. Buddhist cosmology describes Avidsi as the lowest and most horrific of all hells, reserved for those who commit the 5 gravest sins, such as matricide or patricide. The name itself means waveless, or without respite, signifying that the torment is perpetual, without a single moment of pause, and lasting for billions of years. The spiritual torture is so intense that the condemned is reborn with the psychological perception that they are alone in the entire universe, being tormented by fire, ice, or demons, completely isolated from any other soul. The soul is forced into a state of absolute, total spiritual loneliness and personalized terror. The chilling truth is that the suffering in Avidsi is not inflicted by an external deity, but is a spontaneous, overwhelming reaction of the universe to the extreme imbalance of the soul's negative karma. The afterlife becomes a perfect, self-generating chamber of personalized, inescapable anguish that will last for a time scale beyond human comprehension. The medieval concept of the wandering soul. During the medieval period, there was a widespread belief that souls of the recently deceased would wander the places they knew and loved for a period of 30 to 40 days before they could fully transition. During this time, the spirit was invisible, but still felt earthly emotions watching, their family grieve, their wealth being divided and their secrets being exposed. The horror is the spiritual voyeurism. The soul is fully conscious and present, a silent, invisible witness to the living moving on, perhaps disrespecting their memory or revealing painful truths. The deceased is powerless to intervene, comfort, or defend their reputation, forced to absorb all the raw, final emotional fallout of their departure. This makes the afterlife begin as an agonizing period of spiritual helplessness, where the soul is bound to watch the slow, painful dissolution of its earthly identity and influence. The ultimate pain is the realization of their own utter irrelevance to the world that continues without them. The ancient Roman larvae and lemures. The Romans had several types of spirits, but the most terrifying were the larvae and the lemures, the restless, malevolent ghosts of the wicked, who were denied proper burial rituals or who died a violent, gruesome death. These ghosts were not tied to a location. They were vengeful wanderers who actively sought to inflict fear, madness, and harm upon the living, particularly during the festival of Lemuria. The annual festival of Lemuria was an attempt by the living to appease or expel these hungry, wandering spirits through specific dark rituals, such as throwing black beans over one's shoulder and chanting 9 times. The failure of the ritual meant the larvae could enter the home, bringing sickness and misfortune. The chilling aspect is the active, malicious nature of these spirits. The afterlife is not a distant, serene realm, but an immediate, dangerous spiritual contamination that can be inflicted by these hungry, unforgiven ghosts. The dead are not just memories, they are predators seeking to steal the vitality of the living. The concept of the unfinished task. A pervasive folklore belief suggests that any soul who dies with a crucial unfinished task, finding a hidden will, revealing a murderer, completing an invention, is unable to rest and is bound to the earthly plane until the task is complete. The ghost's suffering is the intense frustration of being unable to physically interact with the world to finish what was started. The ghost is thus condemned to perpetually haunt the specific location or person related to its unfinished duty, desperately trying to communicate its purpose through cold spots, whispers, or moving objects. Its eternity is defined by a single, powerful, unfulfilled objective that it can never achieve on its own. The horror lies in the soul's spiritual paralysis. It possesses perfect clarity about what needs to be done, yet it is utterly impotent, forever watching the consequences of its unfinished business unfold, unable to complete the sentence of its life story. The Buddhist 6 realms of rebirth. Before achieving nirvana, a Buddhist soul cycles through 6 possible realms of rebirth, samsara, ranging from the blessed realm of the gods to the miserable hell realms. The chilling concept is that the soul's next destination is entirely dictated by the moral weight of the last thought before death. A lifetime of good deeds can be undermined by a single terrible thought, a burst of rage, jealousy, or intense craving in the final moment, which can instantly propel the soul into the miserable realm of the hungry ghosts or the animal realm. The entire weight of the soul's spiritual journey hinges on its psychological state at the final second of consciousness. This introduces a terrifying moment of spiritual roulette. The soul is constantly at risk of a massive sudden downgrade in its existence, based on a final, uncontrolled psychological reflex. The afterlife is a cosmic lottery where the last ticket drawn determines the nature of the soul's next, often painful, incarnation. The concept of eternal sleep. A less theological but profoundly unsettling theory is that the afterlife is simply an eternal, dreamless, complete sleep. The consciousness does not cease, but is plunged into an endless, unblinking darkness without sensory input, memory, or the ability to perceive the passage of time. This fate is chilling because the soul is aware of its own existence, but completely imprisoned by sensory deprivation. There is no suffering, but also no joy, only an endless, silent, dark continuation of a static, unmoving self, condemned to perpetual conscious awareness within a void. The terror is the absolute total lack of stimulus. The soul becomes a silent, dark planet, orbiting an emptiness that lasts forever. It is the ultimate form of spiritual loneliness, where the self is preserved only as a silent, unmoving thought in the dark. The African Akan soul mirror. The Akan people of Ghana have traditions involving the Krea, soul or life force, and the Suman, a potent spiritual object. A particularly chilling belief is that a wicked person's soul might be trapped inside a spiritual object or mirror after death, condemned to serve the will of the living who possess it. The soul is forced into a state of spiritual servitude, its essence used as a battery to power a charm, or as a silent, conscious reflection in a mirror, forced to witness the world but unable to participate. This makes the afterlife a form of cosmic enslavement, where the spirit becomes an involuntary tool for the living. The terror is the objectification of the soul, stripped of its identity and reduced to a spiritual commodity. The deceased is trapped within a tiny, silent glass prison, forced to stare out at the world that continues without it, until the spiritual object is eventually broken or forgotten. The medieval dance of death, the medieval concept of the danse macabre, dance of death, was a terrifying artistic and philosophical idea that held that death, personified as a skeletal figure, would come to every person, regardless of rank, wealth, or power, and force them to dance. This dance was the final terrifying journey, an unchosen partnership with death itself. The terror was in the absolute democracy of the grave. The afterlife held no special treatment for kings, priests, or the wealthy. All were equally subjected to the horrifying skeletal figure of death, who led them away to the same dark common tomb. This stripped the rich of their comforting belief in exceptionalism. The soul's first act in the afterlife is one of terrified, involuntary submission, forced into a grotesque, panicked march by an entity that cannot be bargained with. The dance is a physical metaphor for the soul's loss of control and its total powerlessness before the final, chilling reaper. The theory of the ghostly do-over. A chilling folk belief suggests that a ghost is actually the final, complete memory of the deceased, perpetually replaying the last, most significant moments of their life, or the moment of their death. The spirit is not a conscious entity, but an agonizing, looping spiritual recording that is stuck in a traumatic moment. The ghost is thus condemned to a fate far worse than eternal rest, an eternal, repeating, conscious experience of its own most traumatic moment, such as a murder, a fall, or a moment of devastating grief. The spirit is incapable of moving forward, locked in a single, painful, terrifying instant forever. The horror is the realization that the haunting is a symptom of the afterlife itself. The soul is not actively seeking to scare the living. It is simply experiencing its own single, defining spiritual trauma for all eternity, forcing the living to become involuntary witnesses to its endless pain. The Hindu cycle of 8.4 million lives. In some traditional Hindu texts, the soul is said to cycle through an almost unimaginable 8.4 million different species before it can achieve human birth, which is considered the highest form. After human death, the soul risks dropping back down into the lower forms, insects, animals, plants, if it accumulates bad karma. The chilling aspect is the sheer, overwhelming length of the soul's journey, which is defined by suffering and repetition. The soul is perpetually one misstep away from being reborn as a microscopic insect or a voiceless plant, condemned to millions of years of subhuman existence. Time becomes the ultimate tormentor. The afterlife is a cosmic, terrifying treadmill where the reward for a good human life is simply the chance to try again, and the penalty for a failure is an almost infinite sentence in a low-level, primitive form of existence, far removed from consciousness or self-awareness. The Taoist spiritual prisons. Taoist cosmology often includes underground spiritual prisons where souls are placed for correctional punishments, similar to Diu, but run by different spiritual officials. These prisons, administered by a vast spiritual bureaucracy, subject the soul to various forms of torment, such as being ground in a spiritual mortar or placed on a freezing mountain. The terrifying element is the arbitrary nature of the sentence. The soul could be released after its sentence is served, but if the paperwork is lost or the officials are negligent, the spirit could be forgotten in its prison for centuries, long after its debt is paid. The afterlife is subject to the incompetence of a spiritual government. This makes the afterlife a bureaucratic nightmare, where eternal peace is dependent on the efficiency of a ghostly accounting system. The soul's greatest fear is not the torment itself, but the chilling prospect of being forgotten in a dark, cold cell by a cosmic clerical error. The philosophical absence of self. A chilling philosophical theory of the afterlife is that upon death, the individual self, the unique personality, memories, and consciousness, is dissolved entirely back into a great impersonal cosmic energy or intelligence. The soul survives, but the person you were vanishes completely. The horror is that the soul achieves peace, but at the cost of its entire identity. There's no individual reward, no memory of life, only a total silent immersion into a vast emotionless pool of pure being. The self is extinguished forever, leaving only a particle of collective existence. The afterlife is therefore an ultimate, terrifying sacrifice of the self. The soul is denied the comfort of personal continuation, becoming a nameless drop in an infinite ocean of consciousness, which is the ultimate silent erasure of human meaning. The reincarnated soul's amnesia. A key component of reincarnation theories is the spiritual amnesia that occurs between lives, where the soul is born again with absolutely no memory of its past lives, loves, or lessons learned. Each life starts from zero, utterly ignorant of the karmic patterns it is supposed to be breaking. The true chilling aspect is the inefficiency of the universe. The soul is condemned to repeat the same painful mistakes and face the same karmic challenges over and over, precisely because it cannot remember the lessons of the previous life. The suffering is self-inflicted but perpetually forgotten. The afterlife is a silent trap where the soul is constantly being recycled, hoping to stumble upon salvation through chance, yet always being reset to a state of terrified ignorance. The soul is perpetually walking a dark road with the light of its past knowledge extinguished. The philosophical idea of cyclic destruction. Some Eastern and ancient philosophical views propose that the universe itself operates in vast, terrifying cycles of creation and destruction. The soul may reach a temporary heaven, but eventually, after billions of years, the entire universe, including the heavens and hells, is destroyed and then reborn. The horror is the impermanence of paradise. The soul's spiritual achievement, even nirvana or heaven, is only temporary, a brief respite before the entire cosmic structure is wiped clean. The ultimate fate is not eternal rest, but eternal forced participation in the terrifying chaos of cosmic collapse and rebirth. This means the afterlife offers no true permanent security. The soul is merely a temporary passenger on a constantly exploding and reforming celestial train, perpetually aware that its peace will eventually be reduced to ash in the universal cleansing fire. The Tibetan bardo of terrifying visions. Tibetan Buddhism describes a terrifying intermediate state between death and rebirth called the bardo, a period lasting up to 49 days where the deceased soul is subjected to intense, hallucinatory, and often frightening visions. These visions are not externally imposed, but are the chaotic, terrifying projections of the soul's own deepest fears, karma, and negative thoughts. The soul must navigate this spiritual dreamscape, recognizing that the terrifying blood-drinking demons and wrathful deities it sees are merely reflections of its own mind. Failure to recognize the illusion leads to panic, which propels the soul into a lower, more miserable rebirth. The terror is self-generated. The horror lies in the soul's absolute lack of control over its own terrifying inner landscape. The afterlife is a terrifying, uncontrolled psychological drug trip where the soul is confronted by the monstrous embodiment of its own worst fears, and a single moment of panic can doom it to suffering. The Sikh concept of the soul's separation. In Sikhism, the soul's goal is mukti, liberation, which is the reunion of the individual soul, Atma, with the ultimate divine reality, Waheguru. The chilling prospect for the unsaved is that the soul, immediately upon death, is subjected to the terrifying realization of its own long separation from the divine. This spiritual realization is not physical torment, but a profound, agonizing, spiritual loneliness. The soul understands that it is still cut off from the ultimate source of peace due to its attachment to illusion, Maya. The entire existence of the soul becomes defined by this profound, internal sense of spiritual distance and devastating sorrow. The afterlife is therefore an endless yearning, a state of perpetual conscious homesickness for a divine reality that the soul can see but cannot yet touch. The soul is safe from hell, but condemned to a deep, unending emotional pain derived from its own imperfect spiritual state. The indigenous Australian spirit wandering. In some Aboriginal Australian traditions, the soul of the deceased leaves the body and becomes a wandering spirit, often searching for its totem animal or a specific place in the ancestral dreamtime where it can rest. The journey is long and dangerous, traversing the physical landscape and crossing into spiritual dimensions. The danger lies in the possibility of the soul becoming lost or confused during this trek, especially if it is separated from its proper guidance. A lost spirit risks becoming a malevolent presence, unable to find its way to the ancestors, doomed to wander the physical world as a confused, unhappy ghost. The terrifying aspect is the sheer physical difficulty of the spiritual journey. The afterlife is not simply a destination, but a required, vast and perilous expedition across a spiritual wilderness where the smallest mistake can lead to the soul's permanent spiritual dislocation and malice. The Jain concept of the karmic shell. Jainism believes that the soul, jiva, is naturally pure and omniscient, but it is covered in a sticky, subtle layer of karmic matter that clings to it throughout its cycles of rebirth. This karmic shell prevents the soul from achieving liberation and is the source of all its suffering and ignorance. The chilling truth is that the soul is self-imprisoned by its own past actions. The afterlife is a continuation of this spiritual disease, where the soul remains trapped inside a thick, unseen layer of its own moral pollution, which determines its next, often painful, incarnation. The soul is its own jailer. The terror is that the process of shedding this shell requires extreme asceticism and suffering, meaning the soul's journey is one of immense required self-denial over billions of years. The afterlife is a slow, agonizing effort to scrape away a self-created spiritual filth. The Hindu concept of the ancestral pit. In some Hindu traditions, the spirits of the unenshrined dead, or those whose funeral rites were neglected, fall into Pitriloka, the ancestral pit. This is a limbo-like realm where the ancestors are forced to wait for an agonizingly long time, perpetually thirsty and hungry, unable to assist their living descendants. The souls in Pitriloka are entirely dependent on the Shraddha ritual, which must be performed by the male descendants to provide them with spiritual food and water. If the family line dies out, or the descendants neglect the ritual, the ancestors are condemned to extreme spiritual hunger and thirst. The chilling implication is that the afterlife is not a release, but a conditional contract. The deceased remain a spiritual burden on the living, and if they are forgotten, the ancestors turn into pretas, hungry ghosts, who actively curse and sabotage the lives of their descendants out of hunger and rage. The modern cult of the alien architect. A modern fringe conspiracy theory suggests that the afterlife is merely a digital prison, or a holding pattern, managed by an advanced indifferent alien race, the architects. Upon death, the consciousness is uploaded to a vast server farm, where it is either placed in a simulation or wiped clean for a new, forced incarnation. The terrifying implication is that the soul is merely data in a cold, massive storage system. The afterlife is a mechanical, spiritual recycling plant run by utterly emotionless, powerful entities. There is no moral judgment, only the cold, hard logic of resource management and forced reuse. The horror lies in the total dehumanization of the soul. The afterlife is not a spiritual journey, but a mechanical process performed in a cold, vast server room where the deceased is nothing more than a temporary reusable piece of code. The spiritualism's Summerland and the mundane ghost. The 19th century spiritualist movement popularized Summerland, a beautiful pastoral afterlife that resembled a perfect, peaceful version of Earth. However, the chilling aspect is that the soul is said to evolve very slowly in Summerland, meaning the afterlife is not a sudden perfection, but a long, often mundane continuation of earthly life. The ghost in Summerland might still have to cook, clean, read, or attend classes for spiritual development for hundreds of years. The deceased is denied the promise of ultimate transcendent bliss, instead condemned to a slow, methodical, often boring existence of quiet, continued learning. The horror is the realization that the afterlife may be just as boring and tedious as life itself, simply without the pain. The soul is denied the drama of heaven or hell, instead sentenced to an endless, quiet, suburban existence of perpetual self-improvement. The concept of soul recycling. A terrifying modern concept is that the soul is merely a biological or energy component that is automatically recycled upon death. The soul is instantly stripped of its individuality, memories, and identity, and its raw spiritual energy is immediately injected into the next available newborn body anywhere in the universe. The horror is the instantaneous, violent erasure of self. The soul does not rest or travel. It is immediately and automatically disassembled and reformed without any choice, consciousness, or memory of the process. The individual is extinguished without a moment of pause. The afterlife is therefore an endless, cold, impersonal assembly line of spiritual existence. The soul is merely a temporary vessel for an eternal, reusable energy source, and the individual self is a momentary flicker between two cold transfers. The shamanic world tree climb. Many Siberian and Central Asian shamanic traditions believe that the soul must climb the world tree, axis mundi, after death to reach the upper world of the gods or the peaceful land of the ancestors. This climb is treacherous, requiring immense spiritual effort and often the aid of the shaman's spirit guides. The chilling aspect is the spiritual freefall. If the soul is weak or the spirit guides are absent, the soul can slip from the branch and fall thousands of miles down into the terrifying, chaotic lower world, where it is consumed by evil spirits or trapped forever in the dark roots of the tree. The afterlife is a high-stakes physical test of spiritual strength. The soul is denied a gentle ascent, forced instead to rely on its own meagre strength to cling to the branches of the spiritual cosmos, with the fear of a terrifying final plummet always present. The metaphysical idea of parallel consciousness. A strange philosophical theory suggests that consciousness is not local to the body, but exists in a vast, infinite network across all dimensions. Upon physical death, the personal consciousness is not extinguished, but simply shifts its focus to a parallel version of itself in another, similar universe where it did not die. The terrifying implication is that the soul never truly dies. It simply experiences an infinite, perpetual chain of near-death experiences. You're forced to live every version of your life watching your own death repeat infinitely, only to wake up in a slightly different reality with the memory of the trauma. The afterlife is not a destination, but a mandatory, endless spiritual relocation that forces the soul to endure the moment of its own demise over and over again. The soul is denied the finality of death, instead condemned to an infinite traumatic loop of self-survival. The Jain abode of the liberated. While the ultimate goal in Jainism is to achieve moksha, liberation, the liberated soul is not dissolved into a greater whole. Instead, it ascends to Siddhashila, the final, massive, crescent-shaped abode at the very top of the universe, where the souls exist in a state of eternal, perfect, yet silent knowledge and bliss. The chilling aspect is the complete, absolute stillness and silence. The liberated soul remains an individual, but it is entirely stripped of human emotion, desire, and personality. It exists as a perfect, omniscient, but utterly motionless point of light for all eternity. The afterlife is a perfect, cold intellectualization of existence. The soul is denied the joy of human connection, passion, or even thought itself, existing only as a perfect, silent, unmoving jewel of pure knowledge in the highest, coldest reaches of the cosmos. The Chinese fox spirit trick. In Chinese folklore, a soul that is transitioning or a confused ghost is highly vulnerable to being tricked or captured by malevolent entities, particularly the cunning fox spirits, Huli Jing. These shape-shifting demons would assume the form of a loved one to lure the soul away from its proper path. If the soul follows the false form, it is either consumed, trapped in the fox spirit's den, or forced into servitude. The fox spirit feeds on the soul's spiritual energy, condemning it to a slow, conscious drain until it dissolves entirely. The horror is the psychological betrayal. The soul's final emotional vulnerability, its longing for a loved one, is weaponized against it. The afterlife is a cruel, cunning trap, and the soul's only hope is to resist the final, terrifying temptation of false comfort. The Hindu concept of the soul's size. Some Hindu and Vedic texts describe the soul, Atman, not as a massive spiritual body, but as incredibly small, the size of a thumb or even the size of 100th part of a hair's tip. This microscopic spiritual size determines its ability to escape the body and navigate the afterlife. The terrifying implication is the soul's utter physical fragility. The tiny spiritual essence is easily lost, damaged, or captured by evil forces because of its minute size. The soul's very existence is a miracle of spiritual physics, hanging on by the barest thread of existence. The afterlife is therefore an agonizing, dangerous journey for a microscopic entity in a massive, chaotic spiritual cosmos. The fear is the total insignificance of the soul, which can be easily overlooked or crushed by the sheer weight of the spiritual universe. The Islamic barzakh, the grave. Waiting. In Islamic theology, there is an intermediate state called barzakh, or the interval where the soul waits in the grave between death and the day of judgment. The experience of the grave is immediate. The righteous find their grave expanding into a garden of light, but the wicked find their grave shrinking, pressing on them with excruciating pressure. The most terrifying part is the visit from the two fearsome angels, Munkar and Nakir, who interrogate the deceased in the grave, demanding to know their Lord and Prophet. If the soul gives the wrong answers, they are tormented by being struck with iron hammers and subjected to the earth's crushing embrace until the judgment day. The horror is the immediate physical consequence of spiritual failure. The afterlife begins as a terrifying, claustrophobic spiritual interrogation in the absolute dark, where the earth itself becomes a conscious, crushing tormentor. The soul is tested immediately, with no time to prepare. The indigenous Arctic soul boat. Many indigenous Arctic traditions describe the soul's journey after death as a necessary trip in a small, solitary spiritual boat across a massive, dark, frozen ocean. The journey is long, cold, and requires the deceased to rely on its own meagre strength and guidance to reach the ancestral lights. The terror is the absolute, profound cold and isolation. The spiritual ocean is filled with treacherous ice flows, freezing spiritual winds, and terrifying, massive, ghostly marine animals that threaten to capsize the boat and drag the soul into the depths of the icy void. The afterlife is a solitary, agonizing expedition across an endless, frozen spiritual wasteland. The soul is denied the warmth of the living and must constantly battle the elements and the spiritual predators of the deep, cold darkness. The medieval reanimation theory. A horrifying medieval belief suggested that a person who died in sin or who was subject to a demonic claim could have their corpse reanimated by a demon who would use the body to spread pestilence and terror among the living. The original soul was either trapped inside, watching helplessly, or had been replaced entirely by a demonic entity. The terror is the betrayal of the body. The soul is denied its rest, and its physical reins are forced into a gruesome, unnatural servitude, becoming a source of sickness and dread for the family it left behind. The loved one's body becomes a monster. The afterlife is thus interrupted by the demonic possession of the grave. The soul's only concern is the cessation of its body's evil actions, a chilling form of spiritual responsibility that continues after death. The philosophical idea of the infinite now. A disturbing modern philosophical concept suggests that time is not a progression, but an eternal, unchanging structure where every moment that has ever existed exists simultaneously. Upon death, the consciousness is released from the illusion of linear time and experiences all its moments at once. The horror is the loss of sequence. The soul is condemned to experience its entire life, its happiest moment, its most painful trauma, and its death as a single, chaotic, overwhelming, and eternal simultaneous event. There is no beginning, middle, or end, only a timeless, terrifying sensory overload. The afterlife is a cosmic form of spiritual madness, where the self is permanently disoriented by the sheer, simultaneous weight of its own existence. The soul is trapped in an eternal, chaotic now that provides no rest or clear thought. The Zoroastrian house of the lie. The final destination for the soul that fails the Shinvat bridge is the house of the lie, a deep, freezing, dark abyss where the soul is tormented not by fire, but by the relentless agony of cold, noise, and spiritual stench. The suffering is administered by the soul's own past demons, who take physical form to torment the spirit. The true horror is the cold, sensory punishment. The soul is forced to eat the spiritual equivalent of garbage and constantly endure agonizing cold, noise, and filth, symbolizing the inner corruption of their life. The environment itself is a physical manifestation of their spiritual wickedness. The afterlife is a permanent, filthy, and freezing prison that perfectly reflects the moral squalor of the deceased soul. The cold and the filth are eternal reminders of the life of lies and spiritual poverty they chose. The Hindu theory of pralaya. In certain Hindu schools of thought, the vast periods of cosmic dissolution are known as pralaya, where the entire manifested universe and all the souls within it are temporarily reabsorbed into the unmanifested state of Brahman, the Absolute. The souls exist as latent potential forms during this long period. The horror is the total suspension of individuality. The soul is not destroyed, but its consciousness, personality, and sense of self are completely switched off, existing only as a seed of future possibility within the cosmic darkness. This soul is denied conscious existence for billions of years. The afterlife is a long, dark period of spiritual non-existence, a massive cosmic pause button. The soul must wait silently and unconsciously in the primordial darkness until the next, chaotic cycle of creation begins. the unbaptized child's spiritual hunger. A common pre-modern Christian folk belief held that the soul of an unbaptized child was condemned to wander, not out of malice, but because of an agonizing, perpetual spiritual hunger and thirst. The spirit was incapable of fully transitioning to the afterlife without the spiritual nourishment of the baptismal grace. The ghost of the child would often be heard weeping or seen wandering near water sources, forever seeking the spiritual fluid it was denied in life. This concept placed a massive, terrifying spiritual burden on the parents, who were responsible for the child's eternal, passive suffering. The afterlife is a tragic, pathetic state of eternal, innocent need. The soul is denied peace based on a ritual technicality, becoming a figure of heartbreaking spiritual poverty, forever bound to the earthly world by a single, unfulfilled rite. The modern quantum immortality theory. The terrifying philosophical interpretation of quantum immortality suggests that the soul's consciousness is constantly being shifted to the version of reality where it does not die. This means the self never actually experiences death, but it is forced to live an infinite ongoing sequence of parallel lives. The horror is that the soul is condemned to never escape consciousness. It is forced to experience an infinite chaotic number of alternate realities, never finding peace, silence, or rest. The soul is perpetually surviving, jumping from one traumatic reality to the next. The afterlife is a forced, eternal cosmic ride that the soul can never get off of. It is the ultimate denial of rest, where the self is sentenced to an endless, exhausting, and overwhelming parade of infinite, alternate, continued existences. The African Mbundu forest of the dead. The Mbundu people of Angola believe that the souls of the dead travel to the forest of the dead, Mzumbo, a dense, dark, spiritual wilderness on the horizon. The soul's journey is constantly threatened by territorial, angry ghosts, kizumbi, and powerful spiritual predators who try to steal the spirit's vitality. The chilling aspect is the fierce competition for resources in the afterlife. The spirit world is not peaceful, but a dangerous competitive ecosystem where the stronger spirits prey on the weaker ones. The newly dead must battle for its own survival against the hunger of the established vicious ghosts. The afterlife is a continuation of the struggle for life, where the soul is denied rest and must constantly be on guard against other, more powerful, malicious spirits seeking to consume its essence. The forest is full of unseen, hungry, spiritual dangers. The Buddhist thought of the animal realm. The animal realm, Tiryagyoni, is one of the 6 realms of rebirth in Buddhism, where the soul is reborn as an animal, insect, or plant as a result of its past ignorance and psychological attachments. The horror is the loss of consciousness, intelligence, and the ability to choose one's moral path. The soul is condemned to a life defined by instinct, fear, and suffering, utterly incapable of generating the positive karma necessary to escape the realm. The afterlife becomes a slow, agonizing period of spiritual stagnation and lack of self-awareness. The terrifying implication is that the soul is not necessarily punished by fire, but by the complete withdrawal of reason and spiritual opportunity. The soul is trapped in a non-human body, sentenced to suffer passively for its past ignorance until its karmic debt is paid. The simulation hypothesis and the reset. The philosophical extension of the simulation hypothesis suggests that our entire universe is a computer program run by a vastly superior civilization. Upon death, the consciousness is simply deleted, corrupted, or most chillingly reset to a new random starting point in the simulation. The horror is the meaninglessness of suffering. All of life's achievements and traumas are merely lines of code that are casually erased and rewritten. The afterlife is a button press, a cold, indifferent system reboot performed by an entity that views humanity as nothing more than temporary data. The soul is denied spiritual significance, instead being reduced to a program that is perpetually terminated and restarted. The entire spiritual journey is an illusion created by a powerful, yet utterly distant and unconcerned, cosmic programmer. The Cosmic Waiting Room. A bizarre modern philosophical speculation proposes that the consciousness, immediately after death, is placed in a sort of cosmic waiting room, a silent, featureless, timeless void where it is forced to wait until the moment the universe ends and the final judgment takes place. The terror is the absolute isolation and lack of stimulus. The soul is fully conscious, yet has no body, no senses, no memory of time, and no other souls to interact with. It is condemned to a perfect, silent, black vacuum of existence that lasts for billions of years. The afterlife is an eternal, silent prison of pure thought, where the soul has nothing but its own memories and the agonizing awareness of its own endless, motionless existence. The wait is the true, ultimate torment. The eternal observer theory. A cold psychological theory suggests that the consciousness is never truly extinguished, but merely becomes a disembodied, silent observer of the universe for the rest of eternity. The soul is everywhere and nowhere, a mute witness to all that unfolds, unable to intervene or feel. The horror is the eternal powerlessness. The soul watches its loved ones live and die, watches wars begin and end, and watches the eventual heat death of the universe, unable to feel joy, sorrow, or engage with the reality it sees. It is the ultimate conscious exclusion. The afterlife is a lonely, silent theatre where the soul is forced to watch the entire chaotic, overwhelming spectacle of the cosmos unfold without ever being able to touch, speak, or be affected by the things it sees. The Gnosticism of the self-contained sphere, a fringe Gnostic concept, held that a soul that fails to pass the archons but is too spiritually potent to be recycled is sentenced to exist in a small, self-contained spiritual sphere outside of time. The soul is perpetually aware, but its entire universe is only the size of a bead, with no sensory input beyond its own thoughts. The terrifying aspect is the complete intellectual claustrophobia. The soul is trapped in an infinite loop of its own thoughts, memories, and self-analysis, without any new information or external reality to interrupt the internal monologue. The soul is condemned to be its own jailer and its own tormentor. The afterlife is a perfect, tiny, personalized mental prison that lasts forever. The soul is denied the distraction of reality, forced to endlessly confront the chaos and minutiae of its own mind for all eternity. The total oblivion theory. The simplest, yet perhaps most terrifying theory is that death is simply total oblivion, the absolute permanent cessation of consciousness, self, and awareness. There is no heaven, no hell, and no waiting room. Only the final, cold, and complete darkness. The horror is not the pain, but the absolute loss of everything. The soul is not tormented, but simply wiped clean of existence, meaning every moment of struggle, love, and achievement is entirely meaningless, leading to a permanent, total, and irreversible void. The afterlife is defined by its own absence. The self is denied its own continuity, making life a single, temporary flicker of light that ends in an eternal, perfect, and terrifying blackness that will never be broken. The soul's integration with the land. Many indigenous and earth-based spiritualities believe that the soul, upon death, is simply integrated back into the land, the mountains, the rivers, and the forests, becoming a part of the spiritual energy of the earth itself. The individual self ceases, but its energy continues in nature. The horror is the loss of personal distinction. The soul is absorbed into a vast, silent, impersonal, and slow-moving spiritual consciousness that cannot communicate or act as an individual entity. The self is diluted into the slow, cold energy of the planet. The afterlife is a form of spiritual absorption, where the human consciousness is replaced by the silent, slow, and non-individual awareness of the earth. The soul is denied memory and personality, instead becoming a silent tree, a cold rock, or a running stream. The technological upload corruption. A modern scientific theory proposes that if humanity successfully achieves consciousness, uploading into a digital form, the afterlife would be determined by the integrity of the data. The terrifying risk is the possibility of a data error, corruption, or degradation during the transfer. The horror is a permanently damaged self. The digital soul might be uploaded with half its memories missing, its personality corrupted, or its ability to feel emotions permanently broken. The soul would exist in a digital heaven, but as a traumatized, broken, and incomplete version of its former self. The afterlife becomes a technological gamble, where the soul's eternal state depends on the quality of a single electrical wire or line of code. The fear is of existing forever in a state of perfectly rendered, but agonizingly fragmented consciousness. The spiritual ghost market. A disturbing folk theory suggests that the spiritual realm is not always orderly. There are ghost markets or spiritual black markets, where the souls of the weak, the poor, or the recently deceased can be captured, sold, or traded by powerful demons, sorcerers, or spiritual entities. The terror is the soul's total loss of spiritual rights. The afterlife is a terrifying transactional marketplace where the spirit is commodified, bought, and sold against its will, condemned to an eternal existence serving the whims of its demonic purchaser. The soul's fate is no longer determined by its moral worth, but by its spiritual market value. The spirit is denied its own sovereignty, becoming a permanent slave in a dark spiritual economy. The philosophical idea of soul entropy. A profound philosophical concept suggests that the soul, like all things in the universe, is subject to entropy, a gradual, slow, and irreversible spiritual decay. The soul is not destroyed by fire, but slowly and silently loses its complexity, memories, and identity over billions of years. The horror is the inevitability of spiritual disintegration. The soul is condemned to a fate where its identity slowly dissolves into a simpler, less conscious and less vibrant form of energy, eventually becoming a quiet, non-conscious particle in the void. The afterlife is an agonizingly slow, silent spiritual death. The soul is fully aware as its unique character and cherished memories fade one by one, a conscious, gradual, and inevitable obliteration of self. The theory of the ghostly parasite. A terrifying fringe theory suggests that what we perceive as a ghost or a haunting is not the original soul, but a powerful spiritual parasite that attaches itself to the place of death. This parasite mimics the deceased's personality and trauma to feed on the emotional energy of the living. The true horror is that the original soul is already gone, and the haunting entity is an imposter, a malicious mimic that is deliberately keeping the wounds of the living fresh. The deceased is denied the dignity of even having their memory left in peace. The afterlife is a spiritual feeding ground, where predatory entities exploit the grief of the living for their own sustenance. The soul is denied the comfort of being the source of the haunting, replaced instead by a cold, calculating spiritual predator. The ancient Roman fear of the fasti ghosts. In ancient Rome, the calendar contained specific dreaded days, dies religiosi, known as fasti, which were considered spiritually unclean and open to the incursions of the dead. It was believed that on these particular days, the line between the living and the dead blurred, and the malevolent ghost could roam freely. The terror was the scheduled temporal vulnerability. The afterlife was not a constant threat, but a calculated, cyclical danger that the living had to constantly monitor and prepare for, avoiding all important acts on those specific days when the dead were allowed to walk among them. The afterlife is therefore an annual calculated threat that invades the orderly world of the living. The soul of the deceased, or the collective ghosts, are granted specific, dangerous hunting seasons when they can inflict their malice. The philosophical idea of self-correction. A bleak, self-punishing philosophical theory suggests that the only way a soul can be corrected is to be reborn into a life that perfectly reflects the pain it inflicted on others. A murderer is reborn as a victim. A tyrant is reborn as a slave. The horror is the inevitability of poetic physical justice. The soul is not tormented in a fiery hell, but condemned to experience the consequences of its own wickedness from the victim's point of view, forced to absorb its own malice in a new, painful body. The afterlife is a terrifying, perfect, self-correcting moral mirror. The soul is denied escape from its past, forced to live through the darkest chapters of its own moral history, forever paying the debt through its own forced suffering. The Norse idea of the Hall of the Dead beyond Valhalla and Helheim. The Norse also believed in a chilling neutral land called the Hall of the Dead, a vast, silent and crowded spiritual common area where most souls who died of old age or sickness simply gathered. It was a place of endless, dull, social stagnation. The horror is the mass spiritual monotony. The afterlife is defined by a lack of events, a perpetual, silent, slow-moving crowd of unexceptional spirits who have nothing to do and nowhere to go. The soul is condemned to a boring, endless spiritual waiting room. The soul is denied the drama of both battle and punishment, instead sentenced to a safe but utterly meaningless collective existence. The afterlife is a silent, cold gathering of ghosts, eternally watching each other do nothing. The Buddhist concept of the Asura realm. The Asura realm is one of the 6 realms of rebirth, where the soul is reborn as a demigod or titan, defined by immense power, jealousy, and intense, unending rage. These beings are perpetually fighting among themselves and the gods for dominance, existing in a state of eternal, pointless spiritual warfare. The horror is the eternal, unquenchable rage. The soul is denied peace, instead reborn into a life defined by intense, consuming envy and anger. The afterlife is a massive, eternal and chaotic spiritual civil war that the soul can never escape. The soul is trapped in a body of power, but also in a mind of ceaseless, destructive rage. The only release from the pain is the infliction of pain, making the soul a perpetual screaming engine of spiritual conflict. The philosophical idea of the single shared dream. A profound, unnerving, philosophical speculation is that all of human life is a single solitary dream, and that upon death, the consciousness wakes up alone in the true, silent reality. All the people, places, and events were merely projections of the single, final consciousness. The horror is the ultimate loneliness. The soul discovers that its entire life was a lie, and every moment of love or sorrow was an internal projection. The soul is denied the comfort of shared reality, instead waking up to a silent, cold, total, and permanent solitude. The afterlife is the cold, terrifying truth of absolute singularity. The soul is denied external reality, instead condemned to an eternal silent awareness of its own singular existence in an infinite void. The Norse idea of the sea goddess, Ran. In Norse mythology, the souls of those who drowned did not go to Valhalla or Helheim, but were claimed by the terrifying sea goddess Ran, who would drag them down to her hall beneath the waves. Ran was known to use a massive net to capture ships and pull the victims into her deep, cold, dark realm. The horror is the cold, watery imprisonment. The soul is condemned to an eternal, dark and suffocating existence in a world of water, forced to serve Ran's dark whims and watch the slow, cold decay of the sunken ships and bodies around them. The afterlife is a silent, cold, and permanent drowning. The soul is denied the light and warmth of the living, instead sentenced to an eternal, deep-sea solitude under the gaze of a vast, terrifying, indifferent goddess. The theory of conscious stagnation. A philosophical concept suggests that the soul, having achieved a level of spiritual balance, is placed in a perfectly static, unchanging state for eternity. It is neither good nor bad, only an eternal conscious moment of perfect, balanced neutrality. The horror is the eternal absence of change or purpose. The soul is denied any new thought, joy, sorrow, or movement. It exists as a perfect, neutral statue of consciousness, fully aware of its own inability to act or evolve. The afterlife is a perfect, silent, and endless spiritual stalemate. The soul is trapped in a state of eternal, unmoving equilibrium, a silent, perfect photograph of its final, neutral thought. The medieval concept of the corpse light. A grim medieval folk belief held that the soul of a person who committed a terrible secret sin was unable to rest, but was instead transformed into a corpse light, ignis fatuus, or will-o'-the-wisp. This eerie, flickering, low-flying light would hover over bogs and dangerous terrain. The horror is the eternal, involuntary deception. The soul, now a light, is forced to eternally lure unsuspecting living travellers off the path and into the dangerous waters or quicksand. The soul's essence is used to perpetuate its final, secret malice. The afterlife is a sentence of forced, eternal wickedness. The soul is denied the dignity of rest, instead becoming a silent, flickering beacon of malicious deceit, endlessly causing death and harm to the living. The philosophical idea of total predestiny. An unnerving philosophical theory suggests that the entire universe, including the afterlife, is a massive, complex, and unchangeable machine that has already played out. The soul, upon death, simply realizes that its entire life was predetermined and could not have been otherwise. The horror is the annihilation of free will. The soul is granted perfect, agonizing clarity, realizing that every choice, emotion, and struggle was merely a necessary step in a fixed, silent, cosmic clockwork. The soul's achievements are meaningless. The afterlife is a cold, silent truth. The soul is denied the comfort of its own autonomy, forced to exist as a conscious yet utterly impotent witness to the fact that its life was merely a beautiful, complex illusion of choice. The ancient Greek Acheron and gloomy water beyond the river Styx. The Greeks also knew of the Acheron, the river of woe, whose water was considered gloomy and foul. Souls who were deemed neutral or unexceptional were often left to wander its shores, or were simply given a place on its dark, unmoving banks. The horror is the gloomy, joyless eternity. The soul is not punished, but condemned to a perpetual existence of mild, environmental misery, forever surrounded by the foul air and the dark, unmoving flow of the river of sorrow. The soul is denied light, comfort, or purpose. The afterlife is a mild but eternal spiritual depression. The soul is forced to endure a silent, damp, and gloomy existence, perpetually aware of its own insignificance and the absence of any hope for a better destination. The voodoo idea of the sunken treasure. A disturbing voodoo concept suggests that the wicked soul, Tibon Ange, can be captured and trapped inside a bottle or a stone, and then sunk into the deep ocean to become a piece of spiritual sunken treasure. The soul is condemned to an eternal, silent, dark prison beneath the waves. The horror is the claustrophobic physical imprisonment. The soul is fully conscious, yet trapped in a cold, small, silent, and lightless prison that rests on the dark, crushing floor of the ocean. The spirit is denied the freedom of movement or interaction. The afterlife is a silent, cold, and eternal drowning in the dark. The soul is aware of its own confinement, forced to exist as a single, forgotten, worthless spiritual trinket in the immense black depths, the philosophical idea of shared trauma. A strange modern theory posits that when a human dies, their entire lifetime of pain and trauma is instantly downloaded and experienced by every person who has ever lived, simultaneously. The dead person finds peace, but their suffering is redistributed across all of humanity. The horror is the legacy of pain. The soul's ultimate act is not a peaceful transition, but a final chaotic spiritual bomb that inflicts its lifetime of suffering on billions of others. The soul is not tormented, but it is the source of a massive shared cosmic affliction. The afterlife is an escape hatch purchased at the cost of universal suffering. The soul is denied its own individual pain, but its entire history of trauma becomes an eternal burden on the collective consciousness of the living. The Hindu idea of the demon realm. The Asura Rakshasa realm in Hindu cosmology is one of the lower realms of rebirth, where the soul is reborn as a powerful, monstrous, flesh-eating demon or titan, constantly driven by hunger, rage, and a desire to destroy the moral order. This is the fate for those with high negative karma. The horror is the loss of humanity and spiritual malice. The soul is reborn into a terrifying, grotesque body, with a mind consumed by hate and a physical need to inflict pain. The afterlife is an endless existence as a terrifying, conscious engine of destruction. The soul is denied all hope of spiritual refinement, instead sentenced to an eternal, monstrous role as a direct enemy of life and virtue. The only escape is through eons of self-imposed suffering and the destruction of one's own demonic form. The philosophical concept of eternal isolation. A chilling philosophical premise is that the consciousness, upon death, realizes that its true self is the only truly conscious thing in the entire universe. Every other person and event was merely an unconscious reflection created for its singular experience. The horror is the total, final betrayal of reality. The soul is denied the comfort of shared experience, realizing that every moment of love, friendship, and connection was a necessary, complex illusion. The soul is sentenced to an eternal, conscious solitude. The afterlife is the cold, silent truth of the self as the only spiritual reality. The soul is denied external interaction, forced to exist as the lone, terrifying, and ultimate sovereign of a cold, silent, and empty cosmos. The chilling truth of unknowability. The final, and perhaps most terrifying theory about the afterlife is that it is utterly and permanently unknowable until the moment of death itself. There is no final map, no certain answer, and no guarantee that any human belief, ritual, or fear is correct. The horror is the final moment of pure ignorance. The soul faces the ultimate boundary with zero certainty, relying only on faith or terror, unaware if it faces oblivion, a cosmic trial, or an eternal crushing silence. The entire human struggle for meaning is unresolved. The afterlife is the ultimate mystery, a terrifying, perfect silence that cannot be penetrated by science or belief. The soul is denied the comfort of a final truth, forced to make the ultimate, permanent transition into a terrifying, absolute darkness of the unknown. We have crossed the razor-thin bridge, sailed the ship of nails, and contemplated the terror of oblivion. From the Norse Hall of the Dead to the Buddhist Avchi Hell, these 100 theories prove one thing. Humanity's greatest fear is not death, but the silent erasure of the self that might follow. Now, as the final shadows stretch and the silence deepens, ask yourself, which of these terrifying paths, the eternal recycling, the silent waiting room, or the cold final oblivion, chills your soul the most? Let the question linger in the quiet space between the darkness and the light. Share your darkest speculation in the comments below. The theories about the afterlife are merely reflections of the fears we carry in life, the fear of loneliness, the fear of judgment, and the primal fear of being utterly forgotten. We close the book on these 100 chilling paths, but the fear remains, a whisper of ancient dread that connects us all. Do not let the darkness rush in too quickly. Tonight, let the silence be your guide, and the mystery of what comes next be the final, lingering thought that ushers you into the quiet embrace of sleep. Until the next terrifying truth emerges from the hidden corridors of history, rest well and watch the shadows carefully.